All right, well, here we are nearing the end of our interview with Dr. Lydia McGrew. I have been so encouraged by some of the answers that she's shared for some of the questions that we have about the reliability of the Gospels. So here we are. We have a couple questions left, and right now I want to ask her, suppose that someone were to say that all this evidence that we're talking about just indicates that people that wrote the Gospels were really good at writing plausible fiction. They came up with all these nuances and all these things that didn't need to be there, and they did all of this to try and trick us. Dr. McGrew, what would you say to that kind of criticism?
Well, it's a good question, and it's something skeptics will definitely bring forward, so we want to be prepared to answer it. So the first thing I'm going to say to that is that kind of hyper-realistic fiction that we are familiar with in our own time, like historical fiction, did not exist at the time in that form. I'm not saying there was no fiction. There was. It was a rather crude kind, but it was not plausible and hyper-realistic like this. And I work in English literature. My PhD is in English, and I can tell you in the history of the novel, the Gospels don't look like the fiction of their time at all. So that's the first thing, and they, of course, don't present themselves as fiction. It's also useful to know that you're going to have to be saying they were hoaxers. You can't just say at that point that it was accepted, at their time by their audience for them to change things, because if they did that, they were deceivers. So that is an option that not everybody wants to go for, but a skeptic is going to go for that. So I'm going to say, that type of fiction that we know now, where someone might tell a story of someone growing up on a farm, and he's like actually using his own memories of growing up on a farm, so he makes it really hyper realistic. That did not exist at the time. Second thing, some of these things make poor fiction. So in our previous segment, I talked about unexplained allusions. Even a modern fiction author would not use that kind of unexplained allusion. A modern fiction author might refer to something where the audience is going to get it. So like I just was reading a 19th century novel the other day where the author says the war was going on, and it's clear she means the Napoleonic Wars early in the 1800s, because her readers will understand that. That's not quite the same thing. And if you watched the previous segment, you saw the examples. They were things that even in the first audience wouldn't have known. They wouldn't have known what the dispute was about purification. They wouldn't have known why Jesus and his brothers and his mother went to Capernaum for a few days. So it interrupts the flow of the narrative. A modern fiction author may try to make some heavy, foreshadowing or something, but it's not going to just throw things in there that are just kind of rocky and interrupting. The third thing I would mention is that these are hard. These are hard to do. If they're not real, they're hard. The undesigned coincidences, you've got, earlier authors explaining later authors. So, how did they even know what they were going to say? They didn't have libraries where you could just, go look things up or Google or whatever. So for those external confirmations, we haven't talked about those a whole lot in this interview, but some of those geographical things, for example, somebody over in Asia Minor couldn't look up whether Cana is, up or down from Capernaum, in Google Maps or something. So, and it's also hard, as I mentioned before, to keep a personality consistent over many different stories. Jesus' personality is remarkably consistent in the Gospels, even in all these different stories. That's not easy to do, harder than you'd think for fiction authors. And now we're talking about 4 different authors who would all have to be writing this remarkably unified fiction, even though they're all writing different books. Really very difficult. And then finally, the details are not distributed like they are in fiction. I've talked about this more on my YouTube channel. I have a video called Gospel Details in the Goldilocks Zone that I just put out recently. Goldilocks was the little girl who broke into the 3 bears' house, and the porridge was too hot and the other porridge was too cold, and Baby Bear's porridge was just right. And the gospel details, they fall into that zone that's just right. If you read fiction, you find, like, in a sense, almost too many details in these modern fiction. It's like detail, all the way consistently through a scene. The Gospels are not like that. They throw them in for a little while and then they'll back off and kind of summarize what happened. It's as it's coming to memory. Of the witnesses that they interviewed, or the author himself if he was a witness. So it looks more like what Justin Martyr called the Gospels. He called them memoir, rather than even looking like modern fiction. It's different the way they're distributed. So if you're interested, look up Gospel Details in the Goldilocks Zone on my YouTube channel for that part of the answer as well. So I think we have a lot of resources for answering that concern that these are just clever fiction authors.
We'll go ahead and link that video in the video description of this video, and I encourage you to check it out. All right, Dr. McGrew, we got one more question. So audience, stick with us. One more question with Dr. McGrew. That's coming up shortly.